Hello and welcome back to Division I Rejects. I'm your host, Kobe Manzo. Tonight, this is D1R 190, December 23rd. We're not quite going to get to 200 before the new year, but that's all right. A lot of big stuff coming from us in 2025. Tonight, though, that's the focus. 2 national championships at the Division II, the NAIA level. We've crowned champions in both Ferris State, Grandview, respectively, taking care of business this weekend on the national stage. Matt Wittwicki from D2Football.com joins me here shortly to talk about the Ferris State Bulldogs, the effect that they've had, and kind of that quote-unquote word of dynasty being thrown around this Ferris State program, and they balled out. Ferris State, top of my notes today, very much still that team, and they certainly are. Grandview, they had another great showing. Excited to have both Jackson and Trinidad, their quarterbacks from those respective teams, on the podcast last week. They both balled out for their squad, so it's been fun to follow them. Some other great football happening at the D3 level. Jimmy will join me later on to talk about our 2 semifinal matchups for D3 football. They're a week behind, so to speak, and they'll play their national championship on January 5th in the new year down in Houston, Texas, so the timeline has got extended for the D3 football championship. One semifinal, a great game, a snowy weather game, 23 degrees down in Alliance, Ohio. The other one was 48-0 at halftime. So we'll talk about both of those later on, kind of a stinker there on the semifinal level. And finally, Matt Schwaerzler will join me later on to talk this NAIA National Championship. Great podcast this week, just recaps of all the games. Of course, we'll cover the D3 National Championship when it gets here. In the meantime, expect a little bit of a break from us when it comes to actual episodes. Obviously, we'll still be producing content covering the teams, trying to delve more into those stories. I think a big piece of this for me is, I kind of mentioned it earlier, is like I'm ready to be done with just the recapping and the covering. I want to dive into some of these people and some of these stories and start to really create some cool work around that. So excited for this offseason. Also want to get out and go on more campuses. So a lot of fun stuff coming from us. But again, the focus tonight, lots of good football. Let's start with talking about that D2 Natty. D2 football season's over in 2024. The national championship on Saturday was a rematch. Valdosta State, Ferris State. This one didn't know how it's going to go. The third time these two teams have met in the national final in a decade, which is ridiculous in of itself. But joining me tonight to talk about it, Matt Wittwicki. What's going on, man?
You know what? We had ourselves another championship game, and the Bulldogs, 3 times out of the last 4, they took care of business in a big way, Kobe.
They absolutely did. That's top of my notes right here. Ferris State, very much still that team. That was kind of the headlining piece for me. And I know I had talked a lot about the last meeting between these two squads. Valdosta got absolutely routed by Jared Bernhardt and company, and we saw the physicality of Ferris State. And I really was sold on the fact that this Valdosta State team is different. And they totally were. Brand new head coach, whole new basically roster, totally overhauled, had talent at all the right positions. Felt like they were a lot more physical at the point of attack. But it just didn't show up, and it didn't translate. And I just don't think we got Valdosta's best on Saturday. Ferris gets up to a 21-0 lead and basically didn't look back. Talk about general takeaways from this one.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Valdosta State is probably a better football team than they showed us.
Mm-hmm.
But Ferris had a whole lot to do with that. Ferris is the light's not too bright on them, Kobe, in these moments. They've been in it so many times. Frankly, they played on really big stages over the last few years, whether it's at Grand Valley, at Montana, at Pitt State. So they've had a whole lot of big games on the road. Whereas Valdosta, this was a little bit newer experience for them, and played a lot of their biggest games at home this year. And they were unbeaten. They had a fantastic season. But Ferris State, when they're clicking, and Trinidad's doing his thing, and the defense is doing their thing, and Coach Anise is dialing it up, man, they're tough to beat at our level, buddy.
Both Coach Anises absolutely dialed there, which that whole family affair is a really cool story, in of itself. But this Ferris State defense, I mean, that was really the sticking point for me. And Trinidad and those guys on the other side of the ball, we know exactly what kind of impact they've had on games like this. But that defense, I think they kind of forced Valdosta into a shell, so to speak, in terms of some of their play calling. It felt like at times throughout the course of their game, I was surprised at how conservative that offense from the Blazers looked, there. And for me, it just felt like from that perspective for Valdosta, it felt like from my perspective, they needed to gamble a little bit more, especially when you have a guy under center like Edwards and you have some weapons on the outside. We saw Slippery Rock get after the DBs from Ferris State, who by all means are great playmakers, but at times are undersized and maybe can't match up with some of these bigger targets on the outside. Valdosta had a couple of them. I expected a little bit more of a gamble and a risk-taking mindset from this Valdosta State team. Did you see a little bit of the same?
Yeah, I know that they were double teaming Bullard for the deep ball,
Yep.
but boy, they missed it on the first play of the game, and honestly could
Yes.
have had a score right there. You got a chance to see how he can run past people, but after that, they were not going to let him win over the top more times than not.
Mhm.
It took Valdosta State longer to get to the mesh routes and a lot of the crossing stuff that they had some success with in the middle of the football game. I thought it took them a little bit too long to get there. And you can sometimes get a false sense of how good you can be in the run game against Ferris. They got a few good runs early, Valdosta did.
Yep.
And then when they really needed it to be able to run the football, Valdosta or Ferris was able to stop them. And if you give the ball back to Ferris early and your defense is not getting the job done, all of a sudden you're playing chase against a squad who is just really good and will get after the quarterback. And I thought Sammy Edwards, he saw more pressure and duress than he has all year.
Absolutely.
He tried to make a few plays, Kobe, and gave up the ball a few times, and it was a tough one that way.
Yeah, he extended on the left sideline there for that fumble that ended up getting scooped up. That was just so inopportune, and especially
Yeah.
when it was such a close play and that we thought that might go back in review. We didn't know exactly what was going to happen, and then the extra point through is going through, and it's like, okay, I guess that's just there, and it just felt a little bit. That sequence was pretty wild.
You know what? For my own selfish reasons, wanting a good football game, I was kind of hoping that they're going to replay that because I thought that was
Yeah.
really close. The
No,
fact
agreed.
that they didn't replay that at all, but at the same time, to some extent, the horse was already out of the barn, and by that time, Valdosta would have just had to really do a whole lot of things right. And I thought in the first half, when they had a chance to get the ball back, kind of late in the half, and then they jumped off sides on a punt and things like that. I thought they had moments where they could have kind of lessened the damage in that first half and maybe had a chance to go into a 2-minute offense. They kind of blew that, and then Ferris scored, and everything kind of went sideways after that.
Yeah, and I mentioned Trinidad earlier on, but this offense with him, I think the big piece you touched on it was that Edwards was really struggling to get into rhythm by no fault of his own early on. And when you can't get a quarterback to start feeling confidence on a stage like that they haven't really played on before, unlike, Ferris, who's been there so often, Trinidad was making things happen himself. I mean, you look at that batted pass that he picks up and turns into a first down, or big time fourth down conversions, or scoring with his legs or with his feet. They had the nice little bit of trickery. They called it Skittles. I saw on Twitter was the play call. He kind of has the option to the left side, and the running back sneaks out down the left sideline, just a little pitch and catch over the top. And it felt like Lady Luck, certainly at some of these points, just on Ferris' side. Also, it was just great play calling and great scheme. But talk about his performance and how I believe he's really cemented himself as one of the best in the country. I think the Harlan Hill voting certainly reflected that. Thought going into that, maybe he wouldn't get as much credit as he deserved because of maybe the statistics standpoint, or some of these other people have had better individual performances. But I'm glad that the winning factor is appearingly still part of that award.
Agreed. He got recognized, I thought, properly
Yeah.
in that, considering the way he really came on in the second half and late. You watch the play that you mentioned where he's going ahead running to the left side. Looks like you got to come downhill. The defense does to stop him in the run game, and then he just stops and pops.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know, how do you defend that? I mean, with the danger he is as a runner, and I mean, you saw that on the very first play of the game. Trinidad went left. The cornerback came up, had a shot at him. Trinidad makes him whiff, and all of a sudden now we're off to the races. And the way that the weapon that he can be like that, 40 yards later, first play of the game, and everybody's just looking around going, wow, this is already happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of weapon he really is. And I think that he is really a difference maker in what they can do offensively this season compared to even a season ago.
Yeah. No, he's made great strides, and him and I talked about that, when he came on the show. And for Ferris, third national championship in 4 years, and another great story of Connor Neer coming back after winning 2, goes to Oklahoma, comes back, picks up right where he left off, and wins another natty, got another trophy. And this Ferris team, led by Coach Anise there, they have cemented themselves. He threw around that term dynasty, and I think after you do it 3 times in 4 years, I think you deserve to throw that term around. Talk about the future of this squad with him and some other big-time playmakers coming back. Of course, Ferris had some great players come out of the portal. They've done a good job high school recruiting, too. I don't want to discredit them there.
You know what? Being an older fellow, Kobe, I have trouble with the word dynasty sometimes, but I normally think of that as a little bit longer time frame. But you know
Sure.
what? Here's my take on this. Ferris State reasserted themselves
Yeah.
as the elite program in Division Two. After last year, I didn't think they were quite as good a squad. I thought Grand Valley, frankly, was a better squad in their own conference than they were, and I think they showed that. But at the same time, boy, we weren't sure coming into these playoffs, Kobe,
Mm-hmm.
if Ferris State was truly the best team, even in SR3.
Agreed.
And then with the way that they took care of business against Harding, it kind of put the rest of the D2 landscape on notice. We're back, and we're back in this kind of way. And Trinidad, I thought, really led that charge throughout this postseason in really impressive and memorable fashion.
He absolutely did, and his difference was felt throughout the course of that. And that Harding game was, to your point, literally nothing that we would have expected. Also, coming off of the heels of the performance they had at Pittsburgh State. And so there are these games where it just made absolutely zero sense. That's part of the awesome piece of college football. And we got an announcement that maybe wasn't the most shocking thing in the world. I think the timing of it was maybe a little bit surprising for some people in this landscape. Tremaine Jackson, the head coach over at Valdosta State, is he came out right and said, he said, "This is my last game coaching for the Blazers." Had some of his comments here post-game that I wanted us to take a look at here.
I just told those guys, I've coached my last Valdosta State. I'm no longer going to be the coach at Valdosta State after today. I've accepted another opportunity. And so those guys were able to form a collective and get to McKinney, Texas. I just told.
And obviously a pretty emotional moment for Coach, I have to imagine. I mean, you get to that stage with these guys. He came and turned this, I don't want to say he totally rejuvenized and turned this program around, but really from their standards, he did, right? You talk about missing the playoffs and where this team and their expectations have been. They call the place Title Town, for Pete's sake, and he comes back and, to your point earlier, restores Valdosta State as a football program in the year that they've had and the couple years under his tenure. And so now, right when it feels like he's getting them right back to the precipice of being one of the dominant forces in D2 football, seemingly from the outside perspective and reading some of his words post-game, it just didn't seem like there was a disagreement between him and some of the athletic staff there at Valdosta in terms of a long-term plan of keeping this program a national power. And now he's accepted the job at Prairie View A&M. So talk about that and kind of the general reaction to his departure.
Yeah, as you know, I've known Tremaine since he was in Sioux Falls back in the mid-teens. Unbelievably passionate coach, and does a really good job with his football team, and a real leader of men. And yeah, I wasn't real surprised by this. I know that they were having a hard time. They're not fully funded,
Yep.
but yet have gotten themselves back to the top of the mountain here and playing for the championship. And that's tough when you're not fully funded, and you can't quite get things to that point. And then at the same time, you're getting offered what's essentially going to be doubling his money from one school to the next.
Yeah.
The facilities at Prairie View A&M are very similar to the championship game down in McKinney or Central Oklahoma, for those who have kind of seen some of those venues. Fits about 15,000. It's a newish stadium, and it's just outside the Houston area where he's from. So a lot of these things, when you start kind of checking boxes, boy, all this stuff starts to kind of come together. And the football team that he had was a lot of grad transfer type guys. Sammy's finishing up at quarterback. He didn't have a young football team.
No.
And, so you start to add all this up. A thing that a lot of people are talking about is, there's also some indecision with the future of the Gulf South Conference that they're in. They only have a handful of members right now. They're having to go find football games with other conferences and things of that sort. And, that can't be a settling thing in itself. So, you start to put all these together and it starts to make a whole lot more sense. And the timing of it, like you mentioned, it wasn't good, but you know what? We have seen this the last handful of times, whether it's, Colorado Mines coach going to San Diego, even Northwest Missouri State's coach about 10 years ago. I mean, it was known before during the game that it was his last game.
Really? Okay.
This is just kind of the news cycle that we now have, Kobe, with regard to football. And no one likes it, but it's just kind of how it plays out anymore.
Yeah, the timeline, right? Because you can't, from their perspective, over at Prairie View, you can't wait around and sit on this forever, right? And they're trying to do their due diligence and at least trying to be, I would assume, respectful enough to wait until that season is concluded as to not cause any controversy or distractions away from a national championship type of event. And I'm sure that's been in the works for a while. He allegedly fielded offers from a couple other top HBCU programs at the D1 level as well. So, it didn't seem like it was too shocking, I suppose, of a story in general. But 2024 AFCA D2 Coach of the Year, we've had him on here. I've really enjoyed him, and I think that word rings true there of passionate and leader of men, and he certainly embodies both those phrases. And you go back to the start of what you were talking about, of it not being a fully funded team, and that is shaken a lot of the D2 landscape. You look at the formation of the GMAC, for example. You talk about a bunch of, for the most part, smaller private institutions that, let's be honest, got maybe sick of competing with the Ferris States and Grand Valleys of the world and wanted to go and succeed off and create their own thing down there. And the GLIAC probably favor the GVs and the Ferrises a lot of times as well. So there's a lot of those decisions do end up making an impact. And to finish off on your point about the Gulf South too, that's the Conference Carolina is going to poach a few of their teams heading into this next season, correct?
Yeah, so now you're looking at a handful of teams remaining in your conference.
Yeah,
you're
tough.
having to go find games and travel budget because you're going to have to go and play other places that aren't in your immediate footprint. So there's a lot of challenges that come with that. That any coach of Valdosta going forward is going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I'd love for them to see what's going on over there in the Lone Star, especially before Simon Fraser got cut out of that, but trips up to Oregon and Washington and the like. But absolutely. But we'll switch over and we'll talk about those super regions here in just a little bit. But I wanted to touch on the final D2 kind of Power 10 rankings from NCAA, kind of compare them to what you guys had over there at d2football.com. I think there's a lot of similarity across that. The AFCA polls, they came out today as well, as you had kind of mentioned. I don't have them pulled up right in front of me. But, as far as this Power 10 goes, I think the consensus of these top 5-ish teams, top 5 to 8 teams, is semi-similar across the board, with Ferris and Valdosta headlining it. Harding, Slippery Rock definitely got a bump after their strong performance in the playoffs against the Bulldogs. And I think one of the bigger pieces here is that you guys felt very confidently in Minnesota State, having the Mavericks at the 5 spot, whereas Wayne Cavati, who, good friend of the show as well, put him here slated at that 9, maybe missing some bigger pieces coming into next year. Talk about the confidence in the Mavericks before we talk about any of the other squads.
Yeah, a lot of times what you're going to see, Kobe, at the end of the year here, whether it's, the AFCA coaches poll or others, is you'll oftentimes see the top 4, the semifinalists, 1 through 4.
Yeah.
In this case here, I think Harding, with how strong a year they had, it's easy to see why they crashed that party, right?
Mm-hmm.
If somebody wanted to go a step further and say maybe Valdosta, because of their performance on Saturday, shouldn't be in the 2 line. Well, that was their first loss of the season. And, you have to look at the entire body of work. You can't just have one football game to find where you land teams. Then looking furthermore, yeah, we had, Minnesota State, given the fact that they were able to continue to win big football games down the stretch through the playoffs. We rewarded them and moved them up to the 5 line. The coaches, I think, had them at 7 in the AFCA poll. And then I think right here you've got, Wayne got him at 9. I'll give my buddy Wayne a hard time about that. But you know what? Wayne does a fantastic job with his Power 10. And, that said, the same group of teams is kind of in this mix here. Slippery Rock, I can't remember the last time that we had a PSAC team in this immediate group in the top 5, I'm going to say. Yeah. And I think, that's a tribute to how well Slippery Rock played, not just in the season, but also in the playoffs with the run, and how well that they played Ferris. Now, at some point, I still have to get down to what football games did you win? Who did you beat? Because it can't be about, well, we played somebody close or something like that for me to move people up too much.
Sure.
But then, after that, I'll be honest, we didn't have Pitt State this high.
Yeah.
Pitt State was kind of the one where, Kobe, here's my thing, is Pitt State had some great wins this year. They beat Ferris State right out of the gate. They beat UCO as well. However, they got their doors blown off by UCM. And then who was it? Or in the middle of the season, Harding at the end.
Yep.
So at some point, I have a hard time having them quite up that high. But they're one of those teams, Kobe, that had a really conflicting year in terms of how you rank them.
That
So
felt
as
like the
somebody who's a
entirety of
voter,
the
it's tough.
MIAA at points of this year, didn't it?
Yeah, and you know what? The MIAA gives you mixed thoughts in itself with the way Central Oak had their
Yep.
game, against Ferris.
Yeah, that was not necessarily a great showing, at least for the conference when it comes to the playoffs. And we know there's a lot of great football down there, but for UCO to go on the tear they did through conference play and just not have it show up on the biggest stage was definitely a tough pill for them to
Sure.
swallow. And talk about the PSAC kind of presence there. You guys had 3 PSAC teams in your top 10 with Slippery Rock there at the 3, Kutztown at 7, and then Cal PA bringing up the 10 spot there. So there's been a couple few PSAC teams in the last, at least since I've been kind of covering the sport. Just a few years ago, Shepherd was in a lot of these national conversations, but Cal PA has been a team that's surprised a lot of people this year. So that PSAC conference feels like maybe the top tier of the conference is extended a little bit.
Yeah, I think Slippery Rock and Kutztown have made good progress here in closing some of that gap that we've seen with SR1 and the PSAC in the last 15, 20 years. I remember when 5 years ago when Slippery Rock hosted Mankato and Mankato won 58-15 at Slippery Rock. That's not who this Slippery Rock team is anymore. And I don't think it's who Kutztown is either. So those two, I think, are both really helping the cause for the PSAC.
Finally here, we talked about those super region mix-up, and this is kind of the slate for next year in terms of how these things get rearranged. And right away, Super Region 3 is going to be the biggest piece that people are going to look at. You take out the GAC, you take out the MIAA, you talk about some of the teams that get substituted out of that region, because that has been the talk of the last couple of years. I mean, the last 4 champions, Ferris, of course, being 3 of the 4, have come out of Super Region number 3. And so now the shakeup here, I think that's going to be the kind of the headlining piece. What else stands out about the new proposed Super Regions going into 2025?
Well, I can't help but notice, Corey, how long our graphics department went to work on this. I tell you, I mean, coming. I mean, this is a good 6 to 8 minute graphic that we created. But no, joking at ourselves. Moving past that, I agree with you that it's going to be. I think it's going to be a lot of GLIAC Northern Sun battles.
Agreed.
Which will be. I'm interested in some of that. There's going to be some of the most physical football is played in those 2 conferences in our D2 landscape.
Yeah, and we got a preview of that over the course of the last couple seasons with the NSIC losing Upper Iowa, adding in that non-conference game. And so I know a couple GLIAC schools have started to pick up, so we've started to get a little bit of a teaser of that. And geographically, it makes much more sense. The Northern Sun, the GLIAC, the really is like the, not to offend anyone, but like the true Midwest feels like is that Super Region 3, and geographically it rights a couple wrongs, in my opinion.
If we can just get Lake Michigan out of the way, it'd be perfect. But and then in SR4, I mentioned it last night on our show that I think this is now going to be the most colorful one because you're going to have new matchups that we're not used to.
Agreed.
Like a Harding playing Angelo State. I like the sound of some of these, and yet they're still within driving distance potentially.
Mm-hmm.
Or Ouachita Baptist playing against the an Angelo State. I like some of those ideas. Then you bring in some of the MIAA schools with that. Maybe a UCO going against Angelo or going against the Hardings. These are colorful new matchups that I'm all here for.
Agreed. And talking on that geographic piece, this is a breakdown from Reddit College Football of those proposed super regions. And this makes sense. Like, to my brain, this clicks together. There's not a whole lot of crossover between all the little colorful dots on the screen that they've put out so nicely there. And we got a pretty wide spread of D2 football, but it does feel like this, at least from just a general geographic standpoint, kind of hits it on the head.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit better. When you take a look very much north in my part of the world, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, we're so spread out that it's only going to do so much, if I'm going to be really frank there, Kobe. But at the same time, I really do think that this is going to help with some of that. And, the main goal, nobody wants to come out and say it, but the main goal, I'll say it, was breaking up, the MIAA from the GLIAC, and having the 2 of what has been considered the power conferences in Division II not in the same super region.
Yes.
Now, Harding has all of a sudden joined that conversation with how well they've played, which has compounded the problem in SR3.
Yes.
So it's good that we have some things split up, and I think it's a positive step forward.
No, I agree with you. And your point about Harding, I think, does ring true, because I think initially when you talk about that quote-unquote problem, which it really was in the grand scheme of things, I don't think Harding and the GAC as a whole was a part of that conversation. Right. And now you look now in Harding, the seasons that they've had, it has not been, I don't certainly want to make it seem like it's been 1 year that the Bisons have been a part of the national picture, but they've just burst onto it in a way that I don't think anyone expected. Then you talk about Ouachita, and even a team like Henderson that was maybe going to have a little bit more of a chance to make some noise when it comes to the postseason. You talk about some of the most, those appealing at-large berths in the different super regions. So I'm excited for that. It'll be interesting to see how that Conference Carolinas conference mixes into things. Wouldn't expect to see anything too crazy out of that. But again, in that super region, maybe they'll have a little bit of a better chance compared to some other squads in that region.
Agreed, totally.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, my man. I appreciate your time tonight. And until 2025, huh?
Thanks for having me, buddy. Keep up the good work.
Appreciate you. See you, Whit. Division III football is a week behind, so to speak, in that we still have another week of football. The semifinals went on this weekend. We had a really great game, and we had a stinker. Jimmy, let's talk about it.
Yeah, the stinker being the 66-0 victory for North Central over Susquehanna. Really was not expecting a blowout like this, if I'm being honest.
No.
Like, as good as North Central is, Susquehanna, they had a really good run, and they ran into quite a buzzsaw here in this one. North Central advancing to their 5th consecutive national championship, the largest margin of victory in a postseason game, and tied for the Division III record for the largest in a national semifinal.
Yeah,
those
so
guys.
I mean, just ridiculous. And I have the halftime score pulled up here because I think that tells more of the story than the final, with 49-0 at half. Excuse me. And we know all about the North Central offense. Luke Lanen, there's not a person in the country that knows D3 football that doesn't know Luke Lanen. And the defense is what we've come to know over the course of this season that has stepped up in a very big way for this North Central squad, and they will be probably the reason they win a championship if that comes to be. The fact that they've held one of the best offenses statistically in Division III football in Susquehanna to a performance like this and limited them to less than 10 first downs on the day and limited a great rushing attack. We had the running back in Le Mans on just a few episodes ago, and this is just a dominant performance. It feels like another dominant performance for this North Central team, and I talked about Lil Landon right there for a second. He ties the D3 record for most career passing touchdowns, 158 in his time as a Cardinal, Jimmy. That number is absurd. Wild.
Yeah, that's quite the number. And I also saw today he won a College Football Network's D3 Player of the Year as well. I saw that.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's
congratulations to Luke on that award too.
Yeah, from AP, I believe, right? Like the Associated Press. I think that was where it was from. But
yeah, I saw another one today on College Football Network too. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Michael does his own set of awards over there as well. So yeah, that's a fan voting award though. It's not necessarily a press or association type of award. But the Cardinals,
hey,
still big time. But Cardinals 14-0. They finished their largest margin of victory. You talked about it, and they allowed the Riverhawks, who were 12-2 coming into this one, they gained just 135 total yards on this Cardinal defense. Stopped 3 drives on 4th down, intercepted 2 passes, filled up every category when it came to the actual stats. The Cardinals looked very, very unstoppable in this one, and they're going to Houston. That's a little bit of the switch up here, as the D3 championship will be played in Houston. Here is a look right here at the stadium. We used it in our graphic previewing the Elite Eight just a few weeks ago. So they will be in Houston. We'll talk about the other team in Mount Union in just a second here, but a really fun time to be a part of D3 football. That stadium is pretty sweet, dude.
No, yeah, I was kind of eyeballing that there. I was like, holy cow, that'd be pretty fun to play in.
It is. It's what looks to be a pretty legit venue. But going through the box score, Lanen, he had 4 touchdowns through the air. He was 16 of 17 for 275 and 4 tuds. No pick. Just the 1 incompletion on the day. Very close to perfect for him on the day, which is ridiculous. Jordan Williams led the rushing attack for this Cardinal offense, and not something that we've come to associate with them, but also partially because they got some other guys in in the second half. I think it's a big part of it. He finishes 16 attempts, 106 yards. Sacco had 82 yards and 2 touchdowns, so he's still kind of the main guy for this Cardinal attack. Had a bunch of different wide receivers catching touchdown passes. But defensively for North Central, you had Philip Carlton leading the charge, 7 tackles, had a forced fumble. Braden Garrigan had a pick and a forced fumble, sack as well, just filling up the stat book all the way around. A couple PBUs from Caden Hartnett in the defensive backfield for North Central, and they're very balanced. They didn't have a single player over 7 tackles, and that's not a shot at any of them individually. It's that they have a unit that cohesively plays really good football together. But talking about the other side of the bracket, Mount Union played host to Johns Hopkins in a game that was really cold at kickoff, Jim. We got a little bit of some real quote-unquote playoff football here. 23 degrees in Alliance, Ohio for kickoff. Had a snow game as things progressed over on campus at Mount Union. Talk to me about this one.
Yes, this was an interesting one. Mount Union did not trail in this game. Coming in 14-0, over 500 yards of offense each, too. Just an absolute shootout. And our boy Echeverry talked about all year. Career high, 183 rushing yards, 7.3 yards per carry. His 9th 100-yard rushing game of the season, including a 54-yard touchdown dagger. Late in the fourth quarter, 3 touchdowns rushing for the kid as well. So just a phenomenal performance. I mean, there's not much of a better time to have your best game of your career in the national semifinal. And obviously, you got next week, a big test against North Central. North Central did prove they could stop the run, but can they stop Mount Union's rush offense? We're gonna have to find out. So.
Yeah, and they led throughout the whole game here, but that lead was as short as 2 at multiple points throughout this game. I mean, Johns Hopkins in the passing game, you see it here. They were absolutely dealing. They were pretty potent offensively when it came to the attack through the air. James Ranello, their quarterback, 20 of 33, 393, and 3 touchdowns. And you see some of the weather coming into play here as it got into the second half, but a great day passing for Johns Hopkins. And the rushing attack is what we've come to associate with this Blue Jays squad. They only finished with 138 on the day, did have 2 scores on the ground, but it was Cole Crotty with 8 catches, 168 yards, and 2 touchdowns. You saw a couple of them there. He was the man making plays for this Johns Hopkins attack. And unfortunately for them, it just wasn't enough. They won a couple great individual efforts. And honestly, you put up this many points against a really good Mount Union team, it just wasn't enough. 45-37 the final, and you're scoring 37 points in a playoff game. You're not able to get the result. I mean, that's tough. But yeah, Echeverry, he finishes 25 carries, 183 yards, 3 touchdowns. That is just another great game for him. You talked about it as a season high. Tyrell Sanders on the outside, 7 catches, 148 yards for the Purple Raiders. I mean, this attack is very, very balanced. TJ DeShields under center, 17 of 27, 218 through the air. This Mount Union team has won a lot of games against really quality opponents. What they haven't necessarily done, and I don't think they care if they've done this or not, is won them in such of a convincing fashion. When you look at their record over the course of the season, I think that would be the one differentiating factor. I would argue that Mount Union has probably played a better strength of schedule going into this Stag Bowl as opposed to North Central. You look, even at the start of the year, remember that game against John Carroll in week 2, 37-31. That was a tough game that we didn't really know how they were going to come out of. And they kind of dominated throughout the rest of the season. You had that, what was basically the OAC championship against Marietta, 28-21, a 1-score game in Alliance. And then you finish off the year against Muskingum, 35-28. Like, they've played some really competitive games, but what they've done in the playoffs is kind of slayed some of those demons. They get that John Carroll rematch in round 1, and they dominated. We were very surprised about it. They go and they beat a quality Carnegie Mellon team. Then that Salisbury game is where I feel like they really turned it on offensively. They kept it rolling with this Johns Hopkins game, and now you're talking about a team that's back in the Stag Bowl. We got a 2022 rematch, and Echeverry's got over 1,600 yards on the year, dude, rushing.
Man, not to mention his 29 touchdowns that also leads the country. It's just ridiculous.
Gosh.
Having an insane season.
Season. Leading NCAA D3 with that. Over 500 yards of total offense for both of these squads in this game. And they'll be playing for their 14th national championship in program history. It is the 23rd Stag Bowl championship appearance for this Mount Union team. And the last appearance, Jimmy, well, it didn't go so well for Mount Union. There's a look, 28-21. Just a few years ago in 2022, North Central, they took that one. The all-time series between these two is in favor of North Central, who has won the last 3 matchups against the Purple Raiders. A feat that I don't believe almost any team could say against this Mount Union squad, especially with the history they've had. So are there some exciting pieces about this being a rematch?
Oh, of course. You obviously now at this point, there's almost like this postseason rivalry that's come about here.
Yeah.
And man, oh man, I can't think of a more like classic Division III football national championship than North Central and Mount Union. I mean, it's probably the two best like perennial programs in the entire country. So it's cool to see like the two big dogs go at it. For sure.
I agree, and I think there's been some rhetoric on the lines of like the one joke that I will admit was pretty hilarious. Is like, this is Yankees Dodgers, like nobody wants this.
100%. That's exactly what it is. Yeah, we saw that obviously this year in MLB too. So
yeah,
bet on the favorites this year. You would have made a lot of money.
Yeah. So I mean, I do understand that perspective, right? And that especially when you're talking about D3 football and coming off a year where Cortland came and just upset the entire scene and really shook up the D3 football world, we were maybe really expecting somebody else to come out as that dark horse. Maybe Cortland was back in the dance. Maybe it was a Susquehanna. Maybe it was one of the other teams that we haven't seen on the national stage. Unfortunately, for those people, these national powers are national powers for a reason. And I am one that I'm excited for this matchup. This North Central team, in my opinion, just has not met their match to no fault of their own. They've been playing some very quality football. Mount Union has found a way to get it done against some quality opponents. Maybe haven't done it in as convincing of a fashion. That doesn't matter. They get one game to decide that on Saturday. And I'm with you. I'm excited for the fact that I think this is probably truly the best. I mean, that's the goal of any playoff, but this is truly the two best teams in the country, bar none. I think you could agree with that one.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you have this 40-team playoff now, and sometimes you maybe think a couple of teams just like slip through the cracks and get in. Not this year. It's the two, as we maybe would have projected before the postseason. I don't know if we did a bracket or not, but this may have been my pick. I mean, I can't just say it would have been, but
yeah.
I mean, who knows? So I mean, this is a very good matchup. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yep, coming up, and I shouldn't say Saturday. It's another week from Saturday. I forget that we have the break, of course, with Christmas and New Year's. So these teams do get a break. January 5th in Shell Energy Stadium down there in Houston, Texas. And you look at the National Championship breakdown right there, graphic from D3 Data, who does a great job covering D3 football and just sports in general. And that number of national championships pretty lopsided. But again, North Central, those two natties, have come against Mount Union in those cases. So really excited for this one. And for Mount Union, it's all about slaying their demons once again, right? They've not been able to really get it done against North Central on the biggest stage. Can this class at Mount Union go ahead and separate themselves? There was a time at Mount Union where it was not uncommon for a class to go through and win 4 national championships every year, which is just a ridiculous feat in of itself. But I'm pumped about it. Any other big notes heading up in this Stag Bowl? We'll do a little a pick 'em before then. I think it'd be fun to feature both these teams in depth.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, but I'm gonna save your suspense. I think North Central's gonna win this football game, but you got to play the game though. You got to play the game. That's what happened last year too. And North Central was a 17-point favorite last year and lost outright. So anything can happen. Any given Saturday, we've said it all year. Any given Saturday.
And to that point too, I mean, got to have a bad taste in the mouths of the Cardinals over there, being there and being at this stage just a year ago and not being able to finish the job. I know there's more motivation than ever to go and finish it. And you hear about guys talk about at the NFL level of the biggest motivating factor for winning a Super Bowl is actually losing one. And I think that factor and that kind of mindset certainly carries and permeates down through all levels of football. And the biggest motivating factor for winning a national championship might have been winning one before and not being able to get right back to that spot. So I would argue, although it maybe doesn't seem like it, North Central has more motivation than anyone in the country, and Mount Union certainly right there, right, getting bested by them in the playoffs and having in their terms, a disappointing year last year, being knocked out by Alma. So really exciting matchup. I'm looking forward to it, Jim. I think that's all I've got for you tonight, dude.
All righty. You have a Merry Christmas, Kobe.
Now time to talk about the NAIA Championship. We had Jackson Waring on the show last week. His Grandview Vikings, they handled business and then some, Matt. You were on the scene, which you don't get to say too often on this show, but you had boots on the ground down there in Durham. Talk to me about this Grandview squad, overall reactions from this one, man.
Yeah, had boots on the ground, had some media credentials over there in Durham, North Carolina. Had a fantastic time on that trip. But man, Grandview, like you can't really say much else besides they dominated, absolutely deserved every bit of the praise they got this season. And Jackson Waring, man, I mean, that's all I have to say about this game. He had 4 passing touchdowns, probably would have had a rushing touchdown if he hadn't fumbled on the goal line to start the game. But man, just an absolute wonderful showing from him. Isaiah Toki catching his first 2 receptions, and Notable stats from Waring that he only completed 11 passes, 4 were for touchdowns. That's just absurd. He took his looks when he got them. The O-line did a great job of protecting. And Grandview's defense, not necessarily something that jumped out at the stat sheet, but being at the game, I can tell you they dominated all across the board today. Keiser only going 1 for 13 on third down throughout the game. And a national title is wild. Yeah, and Grandview's offense, to put it, they took advantage of those situations. They went 7 for 11 on third down, just super efficient on the day. Knew exactly what they wanted to do going into this game, executed to perfection. I mean, they were in control the entire time.
Dude, talk about that Waring to Toki connection. I mean, we've seen it throughout the playoffs, and it feels like those two connect, and they connect early. It feels like they're one of the first scorers in a lot of these late-round playoff games. You had the chance to talk to him, it sounds like. Tell me about what he said about his quarterback.
Yeah, asked him after the game, that connection with Waring. It's very obvious that they have that connection going for them, and he said that's his brother. I mean, everybody on the team rallies around him. Got to talk to head coach Woodley as well. Mentioned the same thing. This team rallies around him. Obviously, he was named the NAIA Player of the Year for good reason, and showed it in this game. It's just absolutely crazy. And not to mention, just with the 4 passing touchdowns for him, he also had 21 rushes for 203 yards at the quarterback position. His line gave him all time in the world to throw. He did really good on that scramble drill. Keiser just could not get the pressure necessary to shut him down at all. And Isaiah Toki, that has a lot to do with it. That connection specifically, you could tell they're tight. Both touchdown passes that worked through to him were absolutely on the money. Read the timing over the middle of the field on that seam route both times. Absolutely perfection. Like, could not have drawn it up better. Could not have thrown it better. Isaiah was in the right spot at the right time just because he knows they have that connection.
Yeah, he showed off the arm talent for sure. It looked like some off-schedule throws, too. It's not like he's, sitting back in the pocket and getting a nice little 3-step and getting a nice hitch into a throw every single time. He's rolling out, sometimes throwing across his body, and he's able to hit targets all the way down the field. And he makes some off-schedule throws that I think are really impressive, and that if you didn't watch any of his throws, looking at the stat line, you think, oh, someone who's incredibly efficient, didn't throw the ball a ton, like, maybe some more on-schedule type stuff. But he was able to do a lot of it, and the stat that stuck out to me, I had it in our notes here. The first team to defeat the last 3 national championship teams in a single season. Keiser in the Natty, then in the previous rounds, Northwestern and Morningside. That is a ridiculous statistic. And 2 other teams in, the GPAC, pair right there that I mentioned that in their own right could have totally been in this game as well. They played some really good ball down the stretch, but beating the last 3 national championship teams en route to earning one yourself.
Absolutely. And Grandview has been so close to the top of the mountain the past few years. This was their second NAIA title in program history, but getting all of those, the previous guard almost, right? It seems like you're getting past all of those trials, validating all the work that this program has put in over the past few years. Woodley, obviously, as the head coach, has been around this program, was an assistant when they won their first title. And it just means a lot to those guys. They've been so close for so many years, and finally just piecing it together in such dominant fashion. It's well-deserved. It's well-earned. And now we also have to consider, man, the Hart Conference. This is just proof that that conference is legit right now, if we had any doubt. Because if this is the top team in that conference and they are just cruising by everybody, the rest of the country better watch out.
I'm with you there, man, 100%. Their mascot is pretty badass, by the way. A cool little Viking.
Victor.
I mean, Viking as a mascot is kind of a layup, I think, in general, but they nailed it. Otherwise, some notes on this one. You had mentioned, Waring with the 200 yards rushing on the day, 353 total for the Vikings. I mean, this game was 21-0. Was it as one-sided in person as it may have seemed in the box score and from checking out the clips on my end?
Yeah, absolutely. You could tell the momentum was just entirely in Grandview's favor. Pretty much every situation Keiser had to swing it back their way, Grandview either responded immediately or stuffed out the flame before it got too hot.
Yeah.
Like they were just ready to pivot and ready to go and were prepared for everything Keiser threw at them. And that's to say Shea Spencer had like a pretty decent game. Like he didn't have a bad game by any means. Their offense was doing all right. Andrew Burnett obviously had a decent rushing day, but Grandview just stepping up when it mattered, and it deflated Keiser. You could see it for most of the game. They didn't know what to do. They had no response for most of what Grandview was putting out there.
Nothing like a nice ice cold Gatorade bath to cap off the festivities down there in Durham. Totally oblivious. You feel like these coaches got to have some awareness of what's going on and maybe catch them in the act there.
It was actually funny because towards the end of the game, even though Keiser wasn't going to win, obviously, you still want to put forth the effort that, like, hey, we still care.
Of course.
So they were using their timeouts at the end of the game, and they still had like 1 or 2 timeouts when that Gatorade bath happened. And they were just like, you know what? Like, whatever. They just like, we're not even going to, do it the rest of the way. But
so you're sitting there soaked for the last couple minutes trying to coach.
Yeah. Just like sitting there. Everybody's trying to figure out, do they call a timeout? Do they not? And the refs were just like, game's over,
Oh my goodness, dude.
Yeah. And it should be noted. Yeah. Pretty physical game too, might I add.
Yep.
Refs were letting them play pretty much the whole time.
Okay.
So it was getting a little chippy out there from time to time. But obviously, national championship game emotions are going to be running high. So,
yep, big time win. The boys, they represent Iowa well. You can see the hardware right there. And I think we talk a lot about the offensive side. I know you had a defensive player highlighted there. Is it Jackson? Is it Filer?
Yeah, Jackson Filer, defensive guy who won the defensive player of the game. Media credentials, we were able to vote for those players. It was hard for Grandview because it was such a well-rounded defensive effort by Grandview where you look at those individual stats and nothing really stands out. But that just means that they all played so well and played so cohesive as a unit that you really could have named any one of those guys towards the top of that stat sheet. Dane Johnson, also somebody who had a fantastic game. Interesting note, though, I don't believe there were any sacks, maybe one across the board, but both the lines came to play. It was just interesting that Grandview very obviously was able to generate more pressure and put a little more heat on Shea Spencer throughout the game. So
no sacks. Just check, by the way, no sacks, not one.
Yeah, so both the lines played really well, but Grandview's defense was still able to take advantage of the pressure they were getting. It's hard, again, something that doesn't appear on a stat sheet because you just assume that both the lines played great. And Keiser's O-line did play great, but Grandview's D-line was also up to the challenge. They were in Shea Spencer's face a good chunk of the time and forcing him to throw the ball out of bounds or take his second or third read and go from there. So,
and that's a talented quarterback, right? Like the ability to, even though they're probably very disruptive, might not show up in the stat sheet because he gets out of the pocket and throws it out of bounds or eludes a defender and has to, do it with his feet. But that defense, I mean, to your point, in the red zone, holding that Keiser offense 0 of 3 inside of 20 yards there in the red zone, a couple big takeaways there for that defense. It was just a really incredible performance. 1 of 13 on third down, you mentioned earlier, just they won every single aspect, seemingly, of the box score. And when you do that and you put yourself in that kind of situation, it's hard to not be on the right side of history.
Yeah. And I mean, another just insane stat from this game is that Grandview forced Keiser to turn over on downs 4 times in this game. 4. Like 4th and 1, 4th and 2. Towards the end of the game, I think there's like a 4th and 4. Dude, they were on it. Keiser was 4 for 8 on 4th down for the day. So obviously not terrible production on that end, but forcing them into all of those high leverage situations just shows that your defense came to play, and capitalizing on half of those when most of those are 4th and short. It's a big momentum swing for you. And it showed, absolutely showed.
100% agree with you there, man. And this Keiser team, I mean, under quote unquote first year, I mean, in the position of Miles Russ, man, to be able to pick up this team and for them to be back in the national championship, I think is, respectable in its own right. And had they gone and done it again, that would have been ridiculous. You lose Coach Socha to Lenore Ryan, who the Lenore Ryan coach made the move up to the Division I level at Mercer. So you had this whole kind of trickle-down effect when it came to these prominent football programs picking up head coaches from lower levels. We've seen a lot more of that with the Bethel head coach or with the Cortland head coach, the D3 level. But, I digress. Like this Miles Russ, what he's been able to do to keep this group together with some new pieces too. Like this Keiser team had quite a bit of few, especially on the offensive side of the ball, I think some few big new faces and additions to that offense. So I would think it's pretty safe to imagine that we'll be seeing them whether or not it's on the national championship stage, we'll be seeing them in the playoffs most likely again in 2025.
Yeah, and it's Keiser had an absolutely great season. Nothing to be ashamed of. Obviously, not the way you want your season to end, but the fact that this team had so much turnover and was still able to produce the way that they did and looked dominant for such a large portion of the year. It's also worth mentioning that the Cliff Harris Award, which is the NAIA Defensive Player of the Year, went to Keiser D lineman Ty Lologo, which is super impressive. Had a fantastic season. But man, Grandview was ready for him. He was. I don't want to say he was silent because obviously he was still making plays and stuff, but he was. I mean, they took
minimize the impact.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
So, but yeah, if you're Keiser, you can't be too upset about this. The team is in a great position going forward. The leadership they have in place, even with all the changes, obviously prepared to make another run like this. So don't expect the Seahawks team to go anywhere. But same with Grandview. I mean, they are just rolling. They're going to have a good chunk of this team back next year. It's going to be fun to see how both teams respond to this in 2025. But Grandview far and away putting themselves above the rest of the competition from this season.
And I think in the Grand perspective, too, this is still a very, very young Keiser team in terms of maybe not their player age, but in terms of how long has this program been around and how long has Keiser been, funding a football program in general, right? And so I imagine they're only going to learn from experiences like these. That's what's crazy to think about is I equate them to a West Florida and the D2 landscape in that West Florida played in the national championship, I think, in their second year as a Division II football program. And so you look at a Keiser team like this, I think it's almost apples to apples. And you talk about geographically, there's literally something in the water. I don't know if it's in the Gulf there or offshore. I don't know what's going on, but it's really respectable. So excited for both those and excited that you got the opportunity to be there, dude. That's pretty fun stuff.
Yeah, it was really awesome. Usually, at NAIFL, Corey's the guy who goes and does it. And just due to scheduling, it fell into my lap this year. So shout out to Corey for hooking me up with those media credentials and letting me get out there. It was a really fun weekend. But being able to see it in person, man, and just seeing how dominant Grandview was, it's hard to imagine any other team would have taken this game from them.
Yeah.
Keiser obviously was not so much up to the challenge, and I don't know if any other team would have been. You'll get some of the other teams, Benedictine, Morningside, like Grandview was just on a whole nother level up to the challenge. So it was really fun to see in person for sure. And hopefully I can be back next year. That's the plan. So fingers crossed.
And that's the feeling you want walking away from a national championship, right? Is like, this is the team. Like nobody was given these, like this is the best squad in the land. And I think that's something that gets lost with, especially talking about the D1 playoffs right now. And people get upset about blowout this and, this team not so competitive. Maybe on the other side, instead of discrediting these teams that come up short, a team like Keiser that we know is a quality football team, let's shift that to more credit on the side of a Grandview, on the side of a credit of the side of a winning team of like, I don't think you want to walk away being like, oh, maybe on a different day, this team comes out, on top, like this, whatever. Like, no, this was the best team in the country this year. And I don't think there's any doubts about that. And that's the way football should be. Does it always pan out like that? No, it's any given Saturday. But I think that's a good kind of leaving note there.
For sure. Yeah. And it was pretty obvious for me, man. And I was there with my own two eyes looking at it. So maybe the TV showed a different story, but looking at the box score, just seeing how everything else shaped up, it was all signs point to the Vikings, all roads lead to Iowa. I
believe they're out there in Des Moines. I want to say off the top of my head.
A lot of freeways running through that place. So, just that.
It is Des Moines. Look at that.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Hell yeah. Well, thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate you, man. And it's been a great year of coverage. We're going to have some more stuff coming down the pipe, but we get a little bit of a reprieve here and a little bit of a break, my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy holidays to you and yours and everybody at home listening. Because this is going out on Christmas Eve, yeah?
Yeah, this will be out on Christmas Eve. That's tomorrow. That's crazy. That's wild.
Yeah. Dude, This year flew by.
It literally did, man. But yeah, thank you very much. Likewise, brother. Have a good rest of your night.
You betcha. You too, man.